Well, thank you so much to Professor Cross, Professor Keel, Professor McFerrin, and the entire awards committee. And a special thanks, of course, to Rory Trammell, who's really taken care of me, not just since I got in town, but really have looked out for me over the last several weeks as we prepared for this. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to receive this award from an institution with such an amazing mission. You know, I'm an institution man. I believe in institutions. And so it's really a pleasure to be here with you in this great and historic city, such an important city for the civil rights movement and for the black freedom struggle. All right, so I wish I could say I would be brief today, but I'm an academic, so so you know how that goes. This is probably slightly too long, but if you hang in there with me, I'm going to play a little video clip towards the end. I guess I'll signal my friend over there, and we'll set up the video. So if you hang in there with me, I'll reward you with a movie. All right. So let's begin with Black Power. Can you hear me okay? Let's begin with Black Power. What was Black Power anyway? Well, Black Power was not just a media creation. It was not a process of social and cultural decline. It was neither the evil stepchild of the civil rights movement, nor the wrecking ball that demolished interracial goodwill and destroyed the nonviolent hope of the 60s. Black Power was not merely a phenomenon of the urban North. It was not purely a manifestation of frustration, disillusionment, or bravado. It was not simply cathartic, rhetorical, or episodic. It was neither the ranting of demagogues nor the work of a few charismatic men. Black Power was an awakening. It was a cultural rebirth, a period of intense political maturation. It was a struggle in the arena of ideas over the definition of the black experience. Black Power was also deeply transnational. Its diverse political currents helped African Americans transcend the narrow Cold War thought that had crippled black politics after World War II. By 1969, Pan-Africanism, a commitment to linking black struggles worldwide, had emerged as one of Black Power's dominant ideological tendencies. U.S. Pan-Africanists wished to forge a modern philosophy of global blackness. They believed white supremacy remained the central reality of black existence throughout the world, despite the advances of the civil rights movement. For them, cultivating a sense of global black citizenship in defiance of American empire was a way to undermine Western domination and combat the psychology of the oppressed. African Americans, these thinkers insisted, were not merely another ethnic group. To realize their destiny, black Americans needed to, quote, die a tribe and be born a nation, as the peoples of Southern Africa and other revolutionary lands were attempting to do. Independent education was vital to this mission. Between 67 and 77, scores of private Pan-Africanist and black nationalist, or Pan-African nationalist, academies arose in black neighborhoods nationwide. The institutions were direct responses to the deplorable condition of many public schools serving African Americans, but Pan-African nationalist education was also an attempt to initiate a rebirth of blackness, a cultural revolution that could connect poor and working class African Americans to the masses of the non-white world. Operators of Pan-African nationalist schools believed a quasi-colonial education had shackled African Americans psychologically, programming them for subservience in much the same way that European empires had denatured their non-white subjects. Escaping colonial mentality meant shedding the standards and values of the oppressor. It meant spurring the metamorphosis from Negro to Afro-American, a reorientation that Malcolm X had both advocated and embodied. If Black Power had a defining principle, it was the notion that revolution in the streets could not succeed without a corresponding revolution, quote, in the corridors of the mind. Acts of self-mastery, along with collective will to metamorphose from an oppressed minority to a sovereign people, were necessary if Black Americans were to seize the power to interpret and control their realities. So Pan-African nationalist schools strove not simply to bolster the academic skills and self-image of urban African American youth, but also to decolonize minds and embody the principle of self-determination. We Are an African People describes a moment in which cadres of activist intellectuals saw rethinking schools in poor and working class African American communities, not only as a way to redeem the process of formal learning, but also as a way to perform Black cultural and political sovereignty. Examining Black power through the lens of independent schools opens new vistas of struggle. Historians too often associate the 70s with cultural malaise, economic and political retrenchment, and decline from the heights of the 1960s mass movements. Today, I hope to highlight the political fertility of the decade, while demonstrating the continuing relevance of some of its radical social impulses. All right, freedom schools. Freedom schools as precursors. Before the rise of Pan-African nationalist schools in the 70s, the quest to remake African American identity galvanized organizers of 1960s freedom schools. Temporary organs linked to northern and southern struggles, freedom schools helped young activists refine the politics of personal and collective conversion. The Mississippi Freedom Schools of '64 were designed to critique segregationist public institutions. The grassroots establishment strove to challenge the myths of white supremacy, usher young people into the movement, and redeem the promise of American citizenship. Freedom schools also nurtured race pride, as had earlier alternative models, including the private schools of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association and Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam. Since the interwar era, those establishments had pursued racial advancement and cultural regeneration. They had attempted to create a separate, orderly Black world as a shield against systemic white racism. Though 1960s freedom schools were integrationist ventures by design, they also reflected ambivalence about the merits of American democracy and liberal reform. What does it mean to be in a mainstream of a cesspool? One freedom school worker asked. What does it mean to be called a normal, quote-unquote, American in a decayed society? Mississippi freedom schools had been created to supplement existing social institutions, yet the competing principle of, quote, building our own institutions to replace the old, unjust, decadent ones was present from the start. The very presence of freedom schools raised the possibility of forming more permanent institutions to challenge the dominant values of mainstream society. Why can't we set up our own schools? Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee leader Bob Moses asked during a civil rights conference in 1964. Note how early this is, 1964, a full 2 years before the popularization of the phrase Black Power. Because, Bob Moses says, because when you come right down to it, why integrate their schools? What is it that you will learn in their schools? From freedom to liberation, from freedom to liberation. By the mid-60s, organizers of freedom schools and other young activists were entering a new phase of struggle. The intellectual shift from freedom to liberation signaled the transition from efforts to redeem American democracy to attempts to arm the oppressed with the tools of self-government. Freedom evoked the civil rights ideal of equality before the law. Liberation, on the other hand, implied an uncompromising embrace of self-rule. Malcolm X's Organization of Afro-American Unity, OAAU, had called the Harlem Weekend School that it established in 1964 a liberation school. The institution reflected the OAAU's global outlook, its indictment of U.S. imperialism, and its solidarity with progressive African nations. Radical impulses within the freedom movement intensified as the 1965 Watts Uprising underscored the limitations of domestic racial reform. By 66-67, the search for political alternatives had crystallized in the rise of independent black political parties and black consciousness splinter movements. Urban rebellions demonstrated the need for an alternative infrastructure that could foster political and cultural awareness while addressing the concrete needs of black and brown workers. The Black Panthers responded by devising survival programs to provide supplementary social services and demonstrate communitarian ideals. Chief among these initiatives were liberation schools, organs expressly designed to radicalize youngsters. Political realities continued to thrust civil rights veterans toward new analyses and approaches. Many organizers underwent a philosophical shift from the pursuit of reform within a liberal democracy to attempt to build the groundwork for an independent black nation, an entity they imagined as a political and spiritual extension of the Third World. The staff members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, exemplified this transition. The genesis of many Pan-African nationalist institutions can be traced to the dissolution of SNCC in the late 60s. Former SNCC workers emerged from the Southern desegregation movement, scattered to various cities, north and south. And generally in the historiography, this is a story of collapse and decline, but actually we can understand this as a moment of genesis and rebirth. Looking to stimulate a transformation of consciousness, these and other battle-tested activists returned to the arena of education. There they refined theories of liberation pedagogy drawn from their experiences in freedom schools, black studies campaigns, and student protests. They continued to embrace the proposition that, quote, an entire school system can be created in any community outside the official order and critical of its suppositions. However, no longer preoccupied with the moral redemption of America, they adopted organizing strategies designed to revolutionize black culture and consciousness. They now saw the construction of autonomous institutions as a step toward formal self-rule. Such establishments promised to supplement the social services that were vanishing from the urban core amid the spending cutbacks of the late 60s and 70s. Parallel institutions seemed capable of offering an alternative structure of authority, a provisional power that could replace hostile and inadequate local agencies. By presenting credible alternatives that fulfilled human needs, such ventures could win the loyalty of the people, exposing the failings of the existing social apparatus and serving as tools of mass politicization. Black Power institution builders concluded that a revolution by education required a revolution in education. Schools would have to be dramatically reimagined if they were to be engines of the new society. By conveying principles of global black solidarity and self-determination, independent schools could help usher African Americans into a kind of post-colonial age. Pan-African nationalists viewed national liberation as the essential solution to the political, economic, and cultural subordination of African Americans. The 60s, after all, was the age of independence, when liberation struggles in Africa, the Caribbean, and other parts of the Third World culminated in the formation of new nation states. But was nationhood the optimal model of black self-determination in the US? Were there more promising symbols of autonomy for contemporary black militants to pursue? The maturation of Pan-African nationalism. The maturation of Pan-African nationalism. With the Nixon administration's attempt to equate black power with black capitalism, radical intellectuals recognized the need for new political directions. By the late 60s and early 70s, some Pan-African nationalists were reassessing their veneration of the nation state and their wholesale embrace of post-colonial governments. The downfall of Nkrumah in Ghana, the eruption of civil strife in Nigeria, and a series of other conflicts and crises across the continent and the Caribbean underscored the shortcomings of national independence. At the same time, the escalation of armed struggle in southern Africa and the Portuguese colonies shifted attention from the post-colonial regimes to ongoing battles against settler colonialism and white minority rule. This transition helped inspire the conversion to what I call left Pan-Africanism, an approach that attempted to root itself more firmly in anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist principles. Owusu Sadaki of Malcolm X Liberation University, a Pan-African nationalist institution in North Carolina, first Durham and then Greensboro, embodied the new orientation. In 1971, Sadaki accepted an invitation to travel inside Mozambique with the armed forces of the Mozambique Liberation Front, or Frelimo. Sadaki spent a grueling 31 days in the embattled country, which was fighting a war of liberation against Portuguese colonialism. Trekking through the Mozambican countryside, Sadaki experienced firsthand the rigors of revolutionary commitment. At one encampment, he witnessed the organization of a makeshift school. He later recalled that, quote, a freedom fighter, one day out of combat with the Portuguese, will put up a blackboard on a tree and with his gun still strapped over his shoulder, begin to teach these younger brothers and sisters. Amilcar Cabral, the West African freedom fighter, offered black Americans an equally revealing model of revolutionary practice. The leader of the liberation movement in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, Cabral communed with African American activists during visits to the United States in 70 and 72. During these summits, Cabral discussed the ethics and methods of revolution. And those of you who have not read Cabral, you have to go back to his Return to the Source. He argued that to avoid replicating the colonial order, revolutionary leaders must subordinate themselves to the aspirations of the people. In the course of national struggle, he asserted, the revolutionary petit bourgeoisie, that is to say, the sort of middle stratum, the middle class that was in a position as a result of the social dynamics of colonialism to actually overthrow colonialism, must relearn its identity from what he called the native masses. Not simply a matter of reviving tradition, this return to the source entailed absolute identification with the revolutionary desires of the lower stratum. Okay, good. So you stuck with me, and as a reward, get to watch this little movie excerpt. Okay, so I'm trying to talk about this philosophical, political transition to left Pan-Africanism, this anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist approach that was very closely linked to African-American solidarity with ongoing struggles against settler colonialism in Africa, particularly Southern Africa. Okay? So Robert Van Lierop is one of the Pan-Africanists that came out of the civil rights movement. He was a lawyer in New York. And he actually traveled to Mozambique as well and produced a very important documentary called A Luta Continua, or The Struggle Continues. So now I want to play just about 7.5 minutes from this documentary, starting at around minute 10:07 or so, all right? So I don't know if we can dim the lights. Can we do that? All right, so that's an excerpt from Robert Van Lierop's 1972 propaganda film, A Luta Continua. It was very, very popular in black freedom circles in the US. So liberated zones, a new paradigm. As US Pan-African nationalists discovered, African revolutionaries were fighting neither for blackness nor for traditional culture. They were struggling for total liberation. And they did so with full knowledge that the decisive element in their campaigns was the people themselves. While this revelation did not immediately transform the cultural practices of independent black schools, it did help reframe the politics of many organizers. Within some activist cadres, the concept of liberated territories, those rural areas that armed insurgents had wrested from the colonialists, began to rival the motif of nationhood as a touchstone of radical consciousness. What were the implications of viewing black American communities not simply as colonies awaiting national liberation, but as zones of insurgent democracy? A territory is inchoate and contested. It is underdeveloped. It is full of possibility. More importantly, it is in flux. Its structures, its mechanisms of governance and distribution remain fluid and may be molded by indigenous inhabitants. A liberated territory must produce the foundation of the new society, but it must do so on the people's terms. Rather than merely anticipate national formation, it must prefigure the democratic relations demanded by the peasants and workers who inhabit the territory. The concept of liberated zones suggested that the development of alternative educational models could help guide the reconstruction of society, not from the top down, but from the bottom up. Rather than instilling loyalty to an unborn nation, indigenous institutions could empower children and young adults to craft a post-revolutionary future of their own design. Teachers would fight alongside the popular masses, taking pains to avoid reproducing colonial dynamics. The purpose of revolution was not to govern consciousness or control behavior. It was not to create a new layer of political elites or to replicate the centralized authority of the modern nation state. Rather, it was to return dignity and decision-making power to the people. Meaningful post-coloniality required the construction of a new order based on qualitative changes in the lives of the laboring classes. Revolution was not an event, it was a process. Freedom could not be orchestrated from above, it had to be engineered from below. So how might the concept of liberated territories help inform grassroots activism today? In recent years, we've witnessed the re-emergence of radical mass politics. Grassroots movements like Black Lives Matter may well fulfill the promise of the Black Power's most expansive political impulses. Young activists are again creating parallel institutions, from communal urban gardens to producer cooperatives designed to prefigure a humane economy. But we must continue to guard against what Fanon called the pitfalls of national consciousness. We cannot merely carve out safe zones for the practice of identity. We cannot merely pursue specialized lifestyles within the framework of monopoly capitalism. The articulation of identity cannot be separated from the struggle to construct a more truly egalitarian society. We must struggle to reorganize relations within our institutions, even as we struggle to transform the larger society. Long after the tides of Black Power radicalism receded, marginalized Americans continued to imagine the schoolhouse as a site of political empowerment and self-determination. Education remains an arena of struggle. We still need radical democratic spaces in which people of all colors can craft and pursue theories of social reconstruction. Today, as many parents, students, and activists strive to reimagine schools that have long stood as sites of civic abandonment and criminalization, a re-examination of recent traditions of educational dissent may prove invaluable. Thank you.